for years. The story was that the German Tiger was an unbeatable monster, and the American Sherman was just a rolling coffin. The actual combat logs tell a completely different story. Tank crews who lived through the fire knew the truth. Paper specifications alone didn't keep you alive in the mud. But the real reason some machines won the war isn't what you expect. This is WW2 reenactment, where we go past the headlines to the real history, what actually happened, the people who lived it, and what it still teaches us today. Today, we are ranking the major tanks of World War II, from the absolute worst to the deadliest. We aren't ranking them by armor thickness or gun size. We are looking at the real numbers, mechanical reliability, industrial scale, and crew survival rates. Because when the hull was finally breached, only one thing mattered: how many men actually made it out alive. The legend is old, the truth is stranger. Watch where this leads. To understand how these machines rank, you have to look at the battlefield. By 1943, the world was locked in a brutal arms race. Tank design was no longer just an engineering exercise. It was a matter of national survival. From the freezing steppes of the Eastern Front to the narrow hedgerows of Normandy and the burning sands of North Africa, the environments were often as deadly as the enemy fire. Designers sat in clean offices and dreamed up mechanical titans. They drew impenetrable armor and massive guns on paper. But a tank is only as good as its ability to fight. A perfectly engineered monster means absolutely nothing if it cannot start its engine in the freezing morning air, or if its tracks sink deep into the infamous Russian mud. To put that in perspective, consider the logistics. A heavy tank requires vast amounts of fuel and spare parts. If a supply truck cannot cross a broken wooden bridge, the machine stops. These weren't just statistics moving across a general's map. Inside every single steel hull were young men who had to live with the fatal consequences of those blueprints. A jammed turret ring or a shattered transmission wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The stakes were absolute. Every nation took a completely different approach to solving this exact problem. Some bet everything on complex technology and terrifying raw firepower. Others gambled on mass production and heavily standardized assembly lines. The tension between engineering perfection and battlefield reality defined the conflict, and the final results on the ground cost tens of thousands of lives. Let me walk you through it. To understand the ranking, you have to look at their origins. The early shock of the Blitzkrieg changed everything. Suddenly, armor was the undisputed king of the battlefield. But as the war dragged on, a massive divide opened up. Germany found itself fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts. Their solution was to build invincible fortresses on tracks. They believed superior engineering could defeat sheer numbers. So they designed the Tiger and the Panther, monsters with thick armor and devastating high-velocity guns. They were designed to destroy anything from a mile away. But perfection has a terrible cost. These machines were incredibly complex and difficult to manufacture. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union faced a different problem. They had to ship armor across oceans or thousands of miles by rail. They could not afford delicate, over-engineered masterpieces. They needed something reliable, standardized, and easy to build. They needed a machine a farm boy could fix in the mud. This created the ultimate clash of military philosophies, the pursuit of the perfect weapon versus the power of the assembly line. But here is where it gets strange. Most people assume the heavier, thicker tank always wins the duel. That is the myth we have been fed for decades. The combat logs from late in the war reveal a chilling reality. When you put the perfect machine into a chaotic war zone, the very things that made it unstoppable became its fatal flaws. And the tanks that were mocked as cheap or weak, they ended up bringing thousands of men home alive. Let's separate the myth from the record. Here is the actual ranking. Let's start at the bottom of the list. The absolute worst major tank of the war. The Japanese Type 90 Hago, designed in the 1930s for infantry support. By 1944, it was hopelessly outclassed. The armor was remarkably thin. A heavy machine gun could sometimes punch right through it. Worse, the steel was notoriously brittle. When a shell hit, the armor didn't just pierce, it shattered, sending deadly splinters inside the cabin. Bravery cannot deflect armor-piercing rounds. Moving up the list are the paper monsters, the German Tiger and Panther tanks, ranked purely by raw firepower and frontal armor. They would easily sit at the top. But war is not a video game. The Tiger I weighed roughly 56 tons. Its transmission and engine were constantly overworked. Wehrmacht maintenance records tell a grim story. To fix a single broken inner wheel, mechanics had to remove multiple outer wheels first. In freezing mud, this took hours. By late 1944, a staggering number were lost, not destroyed by enemy fire, but abandoned by their own crews, blown up because they broke down or ran dry. Then we have the legend with a fatal catch, the Soviet T-34. Strategically, this machine won the Eastern Front. It was cheap, fast, and produced in massive numbers. But let's separate the myth from the record. For the men inside, the early models were a nightmare. Many lacked radios, forcing commanders to use hand signals. The internal layout caused severe crew fatigue, and the heavy main hatch was notoriously difficult to open. The T-34 won the war of attrition, but the casualty rate of Soviet tankers was horrifyingly high, which brings us to the deadliest tank of the war, the American M4 Sherman. Post-war rumors labeled them as rolling fire traps. The actual ordnance reports prove the exact opposite. Later models were equipped with wet stowage, ammunition racks that drastically reduced catastrophic fires. Most importantly, the Sherman prioritized crew survival. It featured spring-loaded hatches that popped open instantly. When a Sherman was knocked out, the crew usually escaped alive. They lived to fight in a replacement tank tomorrow. That is how you win a global war. It is easy to look at these steel machines and forget what powered them. Strip away the hardware, and it comes down to one thing: flesh and blood. These weren't statistics. They were teenagers, most of them, a long way from home, locked inside a cramped metal box. To understand the real ranking, you have to step inside the turret. The daily conditions were almost unimaginable. In the summer, the interior temperature could exceed 120 degrees. In the freezing winter, the bare steel would stick to human skin. The noise of the engine and tracks was absolutely deafening. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and burnt cordite. But the ultimate terror for every single tank crew was fire. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated the hull, it didn't just punch a hole. It sent a deadly spray of white-hot shrapnel bouncing around the enclosed space. If it hit the ammunition racks, the tank would ignite in seconds. This is where the engineering philosophies met brutal human reality. Somewhere in that line was a 19-year-old loader trying to push open a hatch. If you were in an early Soviet T-34, the heavy turret hatch was a nightmare. A wounded or panicked soldier often couldn't lift it in time. If you were in a German Panther, a broken transmission meant you were a sitting duck, trapped inside while enemy artillery zeroed in on your position. But if you were in an American Sherman, the spring-loaded hatches popped open instantly with a single shove. That fraction of a second was the entire difference between life and death. The men who fought in these machines knew the undeniable truth. They didn't care about thick frontal armor on paper or the exaggerated propaganda broadcasts from headquarters. They cared about whether their machine gave them a fighting chance to see tomorrow. For tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, that simple design choice brought them home. So what actually happened when these opposing philosophies finally collided? Which brings us to the turning point. By late 1944, logistics crushed the myth of invincibility. During the Battle of the Bulge, Germany committed its heaviest armor. King Tigers and Panthers tore through the initial American lines. They won the early tactical engagements with terrifying ease. They left broken Allied armor burning in the freezing snow. But a tank without fuel is just a 60-ton steel pillbox, and a tank with a shattered transmission cannot retreat. The American supply network, however, was a relentless, grinding machine. For every Sherman knocked out, another rolled off a cargo ship. More importantly, the crews who escaped those spring-loaded hatches came back. They returned to the front lines with hard-won combat experience. Meanwhile, the German war machine was slowly bleeding from the inside. Their advanced panzers broke down on narrow, muddy winter roads, without spare parts or heavy recovery vehicles. The crews were stranded. They had to make a bitter, unavoidable choice. They planted explosive charges inside their own engineering marvels. They blew up their magnificent machines and walked back on foot. That is the moment the armored war was truly decided. It wasn't won in a cinematic duel across an open field. It was won in the muddy, freezing repair depots. It was won by the roaring factories and endless supply convoys. The Sherman kept moving forward because it was designed for reality. It was built to be quickly fixed in the dirt. The heavy German armor was built for a perfect war, a war that simply did not exist. When the fuel lines ran dry, engineering perfection completely failed, and the reliable, mass-produced machine inherited the burning battlefield. Here is the lesson buried in the mud and rust. When we look back at the Second World War, it is easy to be seduced by the complex blueprints. We romanticize the massive guns and the impenetrable armor plates, but a weapon is only a tool for a soldier, and warfare is ultimately a grim and unforgiving human endeavor. The catastrophic failure of the German heavy armor programs, it teaches a brutal but undeniable truth about modern conflict. Technological arrogance is a fatal weakness in a global war. If a machine requires perfect conditions to operate efficiently, it will inevitably fail when conditions are at their worst. And in combat, conditions are always at their absolute worst. The Allied approach proved that standardized parts and mass production win campaigns, but the American Sherman proved something even more deeply important. It proved that a machine must protect the human body. Those spring-loaded hatches were not an offensive battlefield weapon. They were a simple acknowledgement that men will make mistakes. They accepted the hard reality that armor will eventually get pierced. When that inevitably happens, the survival of the crew is paramount. A dead crew takes their irreplaceable combat experience to the grave. A surviving crew climbs into a new vehicle tomorrow morning. They return to the front line stronger than they were yesterday. They carry the hard lessons learned back into the fight. The greatest military engineering does not ignore the soldier's vulnerability. It embraces it, protects it, and relies on human resilience. That resilience is what ultimately broke the myth of invincibility. So, here is my honest take on this entire debate. For decades, we have judged these machines by the wrong metrics. We treat military history like a massive game of statistics. We argue endlessly about the muzzle velocity of a German 88 or the exact thickness of a Soviet heavy tank hull. But I would argue the true heroes are often overlooked. They weren't just the famous tank aces with high kill counts. They were the exhausted mechanics working in freezing repair depots. They were the logistics officers organizing endless convoys of spare parts. And they were the pragmatic engineers who accepted a harsh reality. Winning a global war means planning for things to go terribly wrong. The Tiger and the Panther were terrifying machines in a static duel. But if my survival depended on fighting in 1944, I would want to be sitting inside an American M4 Sherman. I would want the vehicle with a spring-loaded escape hatch. I would want the engine that actually starts in the freezing mud. Because the ultimate goal of a soldier isn't just to destroy the enemy, it is to survive the absolute nightmare and actually make it home. That is the true measure of a successful wartime design. You decide what it means. That is the point of exploring these historical records. I want to know what you think about this ranking. Which historical tank would you have actually trusted your life to? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you value this kind of real history over the Hollywood myths, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join the channel. And if you want to hear another true story from the front lines, click the video on your screen right now. I will see you in the next one.